Night of the Living Dead, directed by George A. Romero, was a masterpiece to watch unfold, and now I understand why it's a cult classic, and also why it's preserved by the Library of Congress as a culturally significant film. But just to begin, I want to note some very important things about this film that really stood out to me, at least for a film from the 1960s. Now, the first thing worthy of note is Ben here, our protagonist, who becomes our protagonist after Barbara can't quite cope with her brother dying and does go into shock. Now, Ben is portrayed as moral, leader-like, and competent, which is very surprising for a film from the 1960s to even have a person of color as the protagonist. And it's kind of funny looking back at this film with a modern lens. It looks like Ben was written to be a person of color, but George A. Romero actually never intended for it to be a person of color. Duane Jones just gave an extremely compelling audition, and George A. Romero gave him the part. And this was actually a very good decision by George A. Romero. Ben was definitely a focal point of this film. Here's a close-up of Ben, and this is the last close-up of Ben we get before he's killed by two white militiamen. And this was the reason why I thought Ben was written to be a person of color, but upon further research, he never was meant to. But the next notable thing about this film are the zombies. Now, the interesting thing is that George A. Romero never called his zombies zombies. They were always referred to as ghouls. But he did make some traditional zombie genre characteristics for the ghouls. They ate flesh, they were killed by a stab or a blunt object to the head, and they also shambled about. He also, however, had some debatable parts about his zombies, or at least that would be debatable today about whether or not they're associated with zombies. For example, as you see here with this medium shot, the use of tools and also the fear of fire. Now, to just very quickly get into the relevant plot, Barbara and Johnny end up going to a cemetery. It's very bad luck on a ghoul apocalypse day, but they end up going to the cemetery. Johnny is killed by a ghoul, Barbara runs away, and she runs away to this house in the middle of the field where the rest of the film will take place. Now, the rest of the relevant plot that happens in the house is Barbara ends up meeting Ben, and then Barbara goes into shock from realizing her brother is probably dead. We then see Ben take up a leadership role and protect her. And it turns out that Harry Cooper and Helen Cooper and their sick daughter are in the basement. The sick daughter will become relevant later, and there are other characters. They're just not quite they're not quite useful in mentioning right now. You should watch the film to see what happens though. Now, just to get into the camera effects, I thought are really important to bring up is George A. Romero loves to tilt the camera whenever situations get tense or action's happening. We see it on effect here. We also see him use the focus, and as we see, we have a focus on Barbara's face right now. And this was an interesting shot, I thought, too. We see there's a tilt here, and then we see Barbara. We see her fall at the tilt right here. And then later she gets up and runs, and we see her run away from this fixed position. Again, Barbara it seemed like Romero loved using the focus and a lot of close-ups on Barbara, as we see here. The next relevant point I want to get across about this film is how Romero did everything very deliberately. And he reincorporated things. For example, we had just had this fixed shot, and then all of a sudden the table leg was flipped into the frame by Ben, and it stays a little too long on this table frame. However, if we see later in the film, we see Ben using this table leg as a torch. Another obvious sign of reincorporation was Johnny. He would later come back as a zombie. But now I want to get into the more interesting characters of this film. The first character I want to get into is Harry Cooper, and he was portrayed by Carl Hardman. You can see him in this medium shot. He played a paranoid older man with a wife and a sick child. Here we see him arguing, and you can see just by his clothes, he is the paranoid man in this film. And George A. Romero really allows Carl Hardman to shine, often giving him cameras like this where the focus is on Harry, and he looks around nervously while characters in the background just stand around normally. And we can see his paranoia was often contrasted with his wife's logical and very cool-headedness. We can see in this shot the amazing lighting going on where it looks like he's almost talking to his silhouette. Speaking of Harry Cooper's wife, her name is Helen, and she's portrayed by Marilyn Eastman. We see her in this medium shot. Helen has an extreme emotional range in this film. She is first contrasted with Harry's paranoia by being logical and very caring of their daughter and not running around, whereas later in the film, when the daughter comes back as a ghoul, she's terrified and screaming. Now I just want to get into a couple interesting shots that George A. Romero put into the film. This medium shot of the ghoul is very interesting. As he bangs his hand against the glass, we see it almost become silhouetted, and it almost matches Barbara's silhouette. This next interesting shot is the first shot of Barbara. It's a long shot, and we see her enter the house for the first time. You can really see the shadows. They play amazingly on the screen. This next interesting shot is shot through a musical box that opens up, and we see Barbara's eye, and we see the focus is on Barbara's face. And again, George Romero really loves focusing on Barbara quite a bit. And now my review is going to be over for some squeamish people. I have a very gory photo up next. It actually frightened me at the end of the film, so if you're afraid of gore, please click away. You will only miss this. 3, 2, 1. And in this photo, we see Helen murdered by her ghoul-turned daughter. And yeah, even by modern standards, this is pretty rough. And that's thanks to the lighting and the makeup, and probably the black and white too. But George Romero really made this film amazing. And I'm really glad I finally got to watch it.